G'day everyone, New Zealand Shores here. Today we're jumping in just to have a conversation around dependent children, the different visa types they're eligible for, how they can accompany their parents to New Zealand, and common pitfalls that a lot of our clients come up against whilst bringing their children to New Zealand, and just a few things to be aware of. We'll also cover off a few common question and answers at the end, and then we would also recommend that if we haven't covered anything that you are potentially interested in about for bringing your children to New Zealand with you, you'll be able to reach out to us and we can answer those questions specifically. So my name is Charlotte Stockman. I am one of the licensed advisors here at New Zealand Shores, and I am joined by my colleagues Fred and Fabian, who are both in the Hamilton office with me as well. So they're going to help cover off some of the information for dependent children that we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, so first things first, what is a dependent child in immigration terms? It's a child that is either born or adopted. So as part of a visa application for the child, or to include the child in an application, it will be naturally needed to establish your relationship as a parent to the child, and this can be done through depending on circumstances, usually through a birth certificate, sometimes adoption papers or household registration documents. Important to note that there is an age limit for a child to apply for a visa on the basis of the relationship with their parents or to be included in a parent application. And that threshold is actually different whether the visa you're applying for is a temporary visa or a residence class visa. So the age limit is 19 years old inclusive for a temporary visa and 24 for residency. Children need to be dependent, and in that sense, they need to be financially dependent. So anyone aged 17 or younger and single is deemed dependent unless there's evidence to the contrary. If the child is 18 or 19, they must also be single and have no children of their own. And then for residency application, when the child is 20, 21, right up to 24, you might also have to demonstrate that they are financially dependent on the parents or an adult for visa purposes. So a child who, for instance, is single and has no children, but is working full-time at the age of 20, for instance, is unlikely to be deemed financially dependent on you and therefore may not be eligible to be included in your residency application. So it's the kind of thing that we discuss with our clients very early on in their immigration journey to make sure the children will be able to be included in their application.
And we will actually talk about what you can do between the ages of 19 and 24 for your child who is dependent shortly as well. So we'll cover that off just to give you a bit more information. Cool. So I will go over basically what rights a child has whilst they are considered a dependent child. So children who are considered dependent are able to accompany their parents with them to New Zealand. So there are different types of dependent children and there are different types of visas available. So typically speaking, if your child is school age, so in New Zealand, children attend school from 5 through to generally about 18, your child will be considered what we call a dependent child student visa holder. And that child will be able to obtain a student visa that allows them to attend school as a domestic student in New Zealand. So what that means is if you're sending your child to a public school, then education is effectively free. If your child is over school age, so if they're 19 or older, they will have to apply for a visitor visa. And the visitor visa can be granted in some instances if you apply before the child turns 20 for the same duration as your own work visa. If you apply for a visitor visa after your child is 20, they will actually only be eligible to hold a maximum of 9 months on that visitor visa. So that is definitely one of those things to be aware of. There are things you can do to help plug that gap, such as your child attending tertiary education as a full fee-paying international student. For some people, that is an achievable thing, but for others, that is quite an expensive threshold to meet financially for the family when migrating. So that will just be one thing to consider. Children who are still at school and aged typically 16 or older, or are either in years 12 or 13, so those are our final 2 years of high school here in New Zealand, are also eligible for part-time work rights. So that means that your child will be able to get a part-time job and work 20 hours per week during term and up to full-time during summer holidays. Your children will also be entitled to free healthcare, providing that they are on a visa that is 2 years or longer. So for anyone who either obtains that dependent child student visa or the visitor visa, which is granted for 2 years or longer, will be able to get free healthcare in New Zealand. Any child that is 20 or older and comes into New Zealand on a 9-month visitor visa won't typically be eligible for that healthcare, unfortunately. So you may need to consider alternate insurances. The visa categories that we have available, I have kind of gone over these already, but for the temporary visas, again, it is up to the age of 19, which is actually up until the day they turn 20, so 19 inclusive. Children are eligible for that student visa. Otherwise, it is a visitor visa after the age of 20 onwards, or a fee-paying student visa, as I've mentioned. Your child can be included in your residence application up until the day they turn 24, but as has already been mentioned by Fabian, the child does have to remain dependent on you. So if, for example, you arrive into New Zealand and your child's 19 and you've managed to get that student visa or visitor visa for the same duration as your work visa, your child does have to remain dependent on you. So they can't go and obtain full-time employment, because if they do, they cease to be dependent, and then they would need to be on their own pathway to residency. So that is just one thing to be mindful of, because that is something we do get asked all the time. I will hand over to Fred for common issues that we often see our clients come up against.
Great, thanks, Charlotte. So we've made a list of common issues that our clients have come across in the process of applying for their dependent children, and one of them would be the dependency of the children. So Immigration New Zealand will be exploring whether or not they're actually substantially reliant on you or any other adults, whether as a parent or not, for financial support. So as Fabian mentioned earlier, children who are potentially working full time may not necessarily meet the threshold for that substantially reliance, because if they're able to sort of sustain themselves, or maybe they maintain their own accommodation, that's something that Immigration New Zealand will be looking out for. And typically, children age between 17 to 20, or 17 or younger, are considered as dependent children as long as they're single. So again, that's another crucial aspect that a lot of people would need to be mindful of, because there are instances where, say for example, a dependent child was in a relationship with somebody and Immigration New Zealand is aware, they may not necessarily meet those requirements. So certainly something to be mindful of is to ensure that your dependent children remain single if they are going to be included in a residence application, or any temporary visa application as well. Another common issue that clients face are parents who are divorced or separated. So in this instance, Immigration New Zealand would typically be looking at documentation proving that either of the person or the parent would have sole or shared custody in an instance where there is a separation. So the production of documentation proving custody is typically required for children age 15 and under, but you wouldn't be required to produce documentation if your child is age 16 or above. And some of the documentation that Immigration New Zealand will be looking for can come either in the form of legal documentation, a court order, or again, legal documents such as a statutory declaration confirming that, and that is signed by the other parent, allowing the child to live in New Zealand. And these are quite a high threshold, Immigration New Zealand, as far as what this documentation entails. So definitely pays to reach out to one of us to discuss what you may have or what you may need to get to prove custody, if you're one of those who fall into the separation category. Um, Another common issue that parents do face with their dependent children is those children who are considered as adults. So, for example, typically age above 18, where they cannot work and they cannot study beyond year 13, which is the last year of high school in New Zealand. So, again, you wouldn't want to be in a position where your child is breaching their visa conditions by continuing to work once they've finished high school. And typically, one potential way to bypass this is if the parent has been able to submit a residency application to Immigration New Zealand and it's in process. There may be instances where the dependent child can, if they're on a visitor visa, they can vary the conditions of their visitor visa, allowing them to work if there is a residence application in process. And then the fourth potential concern that a lot of our clients face is regarding medical, the situation of the dependent child. So, for example, let's say the child is not of an acceptable standard of health from an immigration perspective, that may jeopardize the application. And by the same token, if, let's say, for example, the dependent child is included in a family's residence application, so that includes the parents and then maybe a couple of children, if one of those children do not um, meet Immigration's New Zealand threshold for medicals, that might actually jeopardize the whole family's application, even though it only applies to one. So, again, something to be mindful of when looking into this process. Again, best if you do reach out to one of us to discuss your situation and circumstances in particular, and we can advise you accordingly on the best way to proceed. And another thing I wanted to mention about that was regarding um, any children who may require special education services. You know, that in relation to, let's say, physical, intellectual, or sensory conditions. So typically, in New Zealand, if there's a relatively high probability that their condition will sort of entitle them to what's called ongoing resourcing scheme or ORS funding, again, that may render your child ineligible to apply for residency, for example. So again, worthy of discussion if that does apply to you.
Awesome, thanks, Fred. So we'll just jump into some of what are our FAQs, our most frequently asked questions about dependent children, because this is obviously, we deal with a lot of families, and making sure that your children are on the best pathway is always a concern for parents. So our first question, what is the status of a child born in New Zealand to temporary visa holders? So for example, you're in New Zealand, you've got a 5-year work visa, you can apply for residency in 2 years' time, and you have a baby born. What is the status of that child?
Yes, I'll take that one, Charlotte. So, even though those children are born in New Zealand, they're not automatically considered as New Zealand citizens, unfortunately. However, if a child is born in New Zealand but is not eligible for citizenship at birth, then they are deemed to hold a visa if either of the parents hold a visa when the child is born. So, typically, you would require Immigration New Zealand to confirm the type and duration of the child's visa. But typically, let's say, like Charlotte mentioned, if the visa is a 5-year accredited employee work visa and the child was born, typically that would be a 5-year visitor visa duration as well.
One thing I will add in there though is that if you are on temporary visas and you then apply for further temporary visas, you do have to apply for a further visa for the baby as well, because if you don't, then your baby actually becomes unlawfully in New Zealand. So for example, yeah, if you hold, let's say, even perhaps a student visa in New Zealand, and then you go on to apply for a work visa, if your baby was born and automatically deemed to hold that visitor visa whilst you're on the student visa, and then you move on to applying for the work visa, you do have to include the child in the next set of applications to avoid your child becoming unlawful. So that is just one thing to be aware of. And what if the child is born and you're already a New Zealand resident? What happens then, Fred?
Yeah, thankfully, in that situation, the child will be a New Zealand citizen at birth. So you'll be able to apply for their birth certificate from New Zealand and also a New Zealand passport. So as long as you hold a form of resident visa, so an initial resident visa or permanent resident visa. If your child is born in New Zealand, they're deemed as citizens at birth.
We often get a lot of people who have babies that get citizenship long before they're eligible for citizenship, which people always find a little bit funny.
Mm.
Cool, next one. So I'll hand this one to you, Fabian. Can I get government subsidies for early childhood education?
Yep, so ECE, early childhood, is typically for children aged below 5. Most ECE centers would accept children from the age of 3 months right up to the age of 5 when they go to school. And most of these centers provide funding to help pay for kindergarten from the age of 3. So essentially from the age of 3 to 5, they would proportionally subsidize 20 to 30 hours per week towards the cost of daycare. And yes, good news, the subsidies are eligible to a vast portion of the population, including migrants on temporary visas here. So for instance, if you're here on a 5-year accredited employee work visa, you have a 3-year-old that you want to place in daycare. If the daycare offers 20 hours subsidy per week, then your child should be eligible for it.
Awesome. Can my 19-year-old child go to university? Fred?
Yeah, so unfortunately, on a dependent child student visa, children can only attend up to high school level. And if they wish to go to university, they would have to transition to a fee-paying student visa. And unfortunately, that incurs international student visa fees. So unfortunately, children on dependent child student visas or visitor visas cannot attend university until such time that the parents and the family obtain residence, for example, where they can attend as domestic students, or the family can finance the child moving into a fee-paying student visa, paying international fees to go to university.
Awesome. So next one, I'm in New Zealand on a work visa. Can I include children from overseas in my residency application if they haven't come to New Zealand with me initially? Fabian, can I give that one to you?
Yeah, absolutely. It's actually quite a common situation if you have adult children still fully dependent on you, but you want them to finish university overseas. So typically the parents would come over to New Zealand on temporary visas while the children would remain overseas, finishing their last, say, 2 years of bachelor's degree. As the parents are eligible to submit a residency application, they can absolutely include the children from overseas, even if they didn't come along with the parents in the first instance, as long as they're under 25, single, have no children themselves, and are financially dependent. So definitely an option.
Awesome. Can my 17-year-old work part-time or full-time? They're still at school. So I did actually talk on this briefly. So if your child is still at school and they're in either years 12 or 13, so our last 2 years of high school, your child can obtain part-time work rights. So they can, as I mentioned, work part-time during term and full-time during school holidays. So that gives them the opportunity to get out and earn some pocket money and be less reliant on mum and dad.
Yeah, I will just add to this that these work rights are not automatic. You actually need to make an application with Immigration in New Zealand to vary the conditions of the child's student visa. And this usually requires written permission from the parents and the school.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Fabian. That's a good little addition there. So that's all for today, everyone. So if you have any questions, if you're already a client of New Zealand Shores, please do reach out to your dedicated licensed advisor, and they will be able to give you some information on what the process may look like for your family. Particularly important to reach out to an advisor, whether you're a client or not. If you've got children who are getting through their high school years and you're ready to sort of start migrating soon, and you need to figure out what that plan looks like for them while you're in New Zealand, or even if you've got any other questions related to bringing dependent children, we'd be more than happy to help. You can reach out to us. Our email address is there, info@nzshores.com, or you can give us a call on 07929 2280, which is our New Zealand number. If you are calling from overseas, you just need to add in 0064 at the start. Thank you so much, and we really look forward to hearing from you.